Welcome to Cosmic Conversations. This week in space, I'm your host, Dr. Samantha Starr, and I'm joined as always by Captain Mike Launchpad and our special guest, space policy expert Zara Cosmos. We've got a packed show for you today, covering everything from SpaceX's latest launch issues to new developments in space debris tracking. Let's dive right in.
Thanks, Samantha. It's great to be back in the studio. We've certainly got a lot to cover this week.
Indeed we do. The space industry never seems to slow down, does it?
You can say that again. Let's start with our quick headlines before we dive into our main segments. Mike, want to kick us off?
Sure thing. First up, Zona Space Systems is expanding its plans for a low Earth orbit navigation satellite constellation in Canada. This could provide an exciting alternative to GPS in the future.
Interesting development. Next, we have Black Sky announcing plans to add military-compatible laser communication terminals to its future Earth observation satellites. This could make their services much more attractive to defense and intelligence customers.
And in launch news, Maya Space plans to use a former Soyuz launch pad at Europe Spaceport in French Guiana for its future launches. Their first launch from this pad is targeted for 2026.
In the realm of space logistics, D-Orbit has raised €150 million in a Series C funding round. They plan to use the funds to expand their space logistics and orbital transportation services.
And finally, the FCC is making more radio spectrum available for non-geostationary satellite broadband services. This should help support the growing market for satellite internet services from companies like SpaceX's Starlink and Amazon's Project Kuiper.
Great summary, team. Now let's move on to our main segments, starting with Launchpad Lowdown. Mike, I believe you have some insights on the recent SpaceX developments?
Absolutely, Samantha. SpaceX has suspended Falcon 9 launches due to a problem with the upper stage deorbit burn on a crewed launch on September 28th. This is actually the second upper stage anomaly in less than 3 months for the Falcon 9 rocket, which is concerning.
That does sound worrying. Can you give us more details on what happened?
Well, the issue occurred during the deorbit burn of the upper stage after the successful launch of the Crew 9 mission to the International Space Station. SpaceX hasn't provided many details on the nature of the anomaly or how long launches may be suspended.
This suspension could have significant implications for SpaceX's launch schedule and their customers. They've been launching at an incredibly high frequency, so any delay could cause a backlog.
Exactly. It's worth noting that this Crew 9 mission was actually the first crewed launch from Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. Previously, all crewed missions used Launch Complex 39A at Kennedy Space Center.
Interesting. Who was on this Crew 9 mission?
The crew includes NASA astronauts Zena Cardman, Nick Hague, and Stephanie Wilson, along with cosmonaut Alexander Gorbanov. They're safely aboard the ISS now, but this upper stage issue is definitely something SpaceX will need to address before their next launch.
It's a reminder of how complex and potentially dangerous spaceflight still is, even with all our advancements.
Absolutely. Mike, based on your experience, what kind of investigation and fixes do you think we might see from SpaceX?
Well, they'll likely do a thorough review of all telemetry data from the mission, particularly focusing on the upper stage systems. They might need to make some hardware or software changes, depending on what they find. The fact that this is the second issue in 3 months suggests there might be a systemic problem they need to address.
Thanks for that insight, Mike. We'll certainly be keeping an eye on how this develops. Now, let's move on to our space debris dilemma segment. Zara, I understand you have some thoughts on the growing concerns about cislunar space debris.
Yes, Samantha. Researchers are raising alarms about space debris in cislunar space, that's the area between Earth and the Moon. As more missions target the Moon and this region, the risk of collisions and debris generation is increasing.
This is a new frontier for space debris concerns, isn't it? We've been worried about low Earth orbit for years, but cislunar space is a relatively new focus.
Exactly. The problem is, there are currently no international guidelines for debris mitigation in cislunar space. As we see more missions to the Moon, including NASA's Artemis program and various commercial lunar initiatives, this is becoming a pressing issue.
What kind of risks are we talking about here?
Well, collisions in cislunar space could create debris fields that make future missions more dangerous or even impossible. Unlike in low Earth orbit, debris in cislunar space won't naturally decay and re-enter Earth's atmosphere. It could stay there for a very long time.
From a scientific perspective, tracking small objects at lunar distances is also much more challenging than in low Earth orbit. Our current space surveillance network isn't really designed for cislunar monitoring.
That's right, and it ties into our next topic. The U.S. Space Force's Space Systems Command has awarded a $25 million contract to Anduril to upgrade the aging U.S. space surveillance network.
Anduril, isn't that the company started by Palmer Luckey, the Oculus VR founder?
Yes, that's right. They've been expanding into defense technology and now space. This contract is specifically to modernize ground-based radar and optical sensors used to track objects in orbit.
This upgrade is crucial. The space environment is getting more complex with the growth of mega constellations and the increasing number of countries and companies launching satellites. We need better capabilities to detect and track smaller objects in space.
How will this upgrade help with the cislunar debris problem we were just discussing?
While this particular upgrade is focused on monitoring Earth orbit, it's a step in the right direction. As we improve our near-Earth tracking capabilities, we can start to expand our focus to cislunar space. But you're right to point out that we'll need additional, specialized systems for cislunar monitoring.
Absolutely. This all ties into the broader challenge of space traffic management, which is becoming increasingly important as space gets more crowded.
Exactly. And it's not just a technical challenge, it's also a policy challenge. We need international cooperation and agreements on how to manage space traffic and mitigate debris, both in Earth orbit and cislunar space.
It sounds like we're at a critical juncture in space exploration and utilization. We're expanding our presence in space, but we need to do it responsibly.
Well said. Mike, now let's move on to our Tech Talk segment. We've got some exciting developments in satellite communications and navigation to discuss.
Yes. Let's start with Black Sky's announcement about adding military-compatible laser communication terminals to their future Earth observation satellites. This is a significant upgrade that could make their services much more attractive to defense and intelligence customers.
Laser communication in space. That sounds like science fiction. How does it work?
Well, Mike, laser communication or optical communication uses focused beams of light to transmit data. It has the potential for much higher data rates than traditional radio frequency communications. In space, it can allow for faster, more secure data transmission from satellites to ground stations or between satellites.
Exactly. For Blacksky, this means they could potentially provide near real-time imagery to military users. It's a big step in making satellite imagery more immediately actionable for defense applications.
I can see why that would be attractive to military customers. What about on the civilian side?
Well, we have some interesting developments there too. Zona Space Systems is expanding its plans for a low Earth orbit navigation satellite constellation in Canada. This could provide an alternative to GPS.
This is fascinating from a scientific perspective. GPS has revolutionized so many aspects of our lives, but it does have vulnerabilities. Having alternative systems could provide more resilience and potentially better accuracy.
How would Zona's system be different from GPS?
While we don't have all the details, LEO constellations for positioning, navigation, and timing, PNT, services generally offer some advantages over traditional GPS, which uses satellites in medium Earth orbit. LEO satellites are closer to Earth, which can mean stronger signals and potentially better accuracy, especially in urban areas or canyons where GPS signals can be blocked.
It's also worth noting that having multiple independent PNT systems improves overall resilience. If one system has issues, others can pick up the slack.
Speaking of satellite communications, we should mention the FCC's recent decision to make more radio spectrum available for non-geostationary satellite broadband services.
Yes, this is a big deal for companies like SpaceX's Starlink and Amazon's Project Kuiper. More spectrum means these companies can potentially offer faster, more robust services.
It's interesting to see how the regulatory environment is adapting to the rapid growth of the satellite internet industry. The FCC is trying to balance the needs of satellite operators with those of terrestrial 5G networks.
It sounds like exciting times in the world of satellite communications and navigation. We're seeing new players, new technologies, and new applications emerging all the time.
Absolutely, Mike. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about some developments in space exploration. NASA recently announced funding for Starfish Space to conduct a mission to inspect space debris. Zara, can you tell us more about this?
Certainly, Samantha. This is an exciting development in the field of active debris removal. Starfish Space is developing a spacecraft called Otter, which is designed to approach and examine pieces of orbital debris. This demonstration mission could pave the way for future debris removal operations.
That's fascinating. How exactly would this Otter spacecraft work?
The Otter is designed to be a small, agile spacecraft that can maneuver close to debris objects. It will use advanced sensors and imaging systems to gather detailed information about the debris, such as its size, shape, and potential composition. This data is crucial for planning future debris removal missions.
From a scientific perspective, this kind of close-up examination of space debris could also provide valuable insights into how materials degrade in the space environment over time.
I can see how that would be useful. But isn't approaching debris potentially dangerous?
You're right to be cautious, Mike. Approaching debris does carry risks, which is why missions like this are so important. They help us develop and test the technologies and procedures needed for safe debris removal operations in the future.
Absolutely. And it's worth noting that this funding is coming through NASA's Tipping Point program, which is designed to support technologies that can foster a commercial space economy.
Speaking of commercial space, we should talk about Maya Space's plans to use a former Soyuz launch pad in French Guiana. That's quite a change, isn't it?
Indeed it is. Mike, Maya Space is developing a reusable small launch vehicle, and they've announced plans to use the former Soyuz pad at Europe's spaceport in French Guiana for their launches.
This is an interesting example of repurposing existing infrastructure as the commercial space industry grows. Can you tell us more about why this is significant, Zara?
Certainly. Using an existing launch pad can significantly reduce the costs and time associated with developing new launch infrastructure. The Soyuz pad in French Guiana is a modern facility that was used until recently, so it should be relatively straightforward to adapt for Maya Space's needs.
That makes sense. When are they planning to start launches from this pad?
Maya Space is targeting their first launch from this pad for 2026. It's an ambitious timeline, but having access to existing infrastructure should help.
It's exciting to see new players entering the launch market. How do you think this will impact the European space industry, Zara?
This could be a significant boost for European space capabilities. Having a Europe-based reusable small launch vehicle could provide more flexible and cost-effective access to space for European payloads. It could also help Europe compete more effectively in the global commercial launch market.
That's great for Europe. But what about the global picture? We've seen a lot of growth in the small launch vehicle market in recent years.
You're right, Mike. The small launch market is becoming increasingly competitive. Companies like Rocket Lab have already established themselves, and we're seeing new entrants like Firefly Aerospace and Virgin Orbit. Maya Space will need to differentiate itself to succeed in this crowded market.
One way they might do that is through their focus on reusability. That seems to be a growing trend in the industry.
Absolutely, Samantha. Reusability has the potential to significantly reduce launch costs, which is crucial for making space more accessible. It's not just about the rockets either. We're seeing companies like Space Logistics, a subsidiary of Northrop Grumman, developing spacecraft that can service and extend the life of satellites in orbit.
Speaking of space logistics, didn't we mention earlier that D-Orbit had raised a significant amount of funding?
Yes, we did, Mike. D-Orbit raised 150 million euros in a Series C funding round. This is a substantial amount for a space logistics company. Zara, can you give us some context on what D-Orbit does and why this funding is significant?
Certainly. D-Orbit is an Italian company that specializes in space logistics and transportation services. They've developed a spacecraft called ION, which can deploy satellites into precise orbits and even move them between different orbits. This funding round will allow them to expand their services and potentially develop new capabilities.
That sounds like it could be really useful for satellite operators. How does this fit into the broader space industry trends we're seeing?
It's part of a growing focus on what we might call in-space services. As we launch more satellites and spacecraft, there's an increasing need for services like precise deployment, orbit adjustment, refueling, and even repair and debris removal. Companies like D-Orbit are positioning themselves to meet these needs.
From a scientific perspective, these capabilities could also enable new types of missions and experiments in space. For example, being able to easily adjust a satellite's orbit could allow for more dynamic Earth observation campaigns.
It's amazing how quickly the space industry is evolving. We've covered so much ground today, from launch anomalies to space debris, new navigation systems to in-space logistics. It really highlights how complex and interconnected the space sector has become.
Absolutely, Mike. And we've only scratched the surface. There's so much more happening in space exploration, satellite technology, and space policy that we could discuss. But unfortunately, we're running out of time for today's episode.
Before we wrap up, I think it's worth emphasizing how all these developments underscore the need for robust international cooperation and governance in space. As we expand our activities in orbit and beyond, it's crucial that we do so in a way that's sustainable and benefits all of humanity.
Well said, Zara. And on that note, we'll have to end our discussion for today. Thank you both for another fascinating conversation.
It's always a pleasure, Samantha. There's never a dull moment in the space industry.
Indeed, there isn't. Thank you for having me on the show.
And thank you to all our listeners for joining us for this week's episode of Cosmic Conversations. This Week in Space. Remember to keep looking up. The universe is full of wonders. Until next time, I'm Dr. Samantha Starr, signing off.
And I'm Captain Mike Launchpad, wishing you all clear skies and smooth launches.
Zara Cosmos here, reminding you that space is for everyone. Let's explore it responsibly.
Thanks again, everyone. We'll see you next week for more exciting space news and discussions.